So I've kind of seen one major objection. There's multiple objections, but one huge objection when it comes to people and the Bible. And one of the biggest objections is it seems like God is almost bipolar. Like in the Old Testament, he's angry and full of wrath. And then in the New Testament, he's like love and full of grace. And a lot of non-Christians will cite that as the reason, like, oh, that's why I don't believe in God or the Bible. Because it seems like there's like two different gods. And it's not just that. Like I see that Christians often have that same thought process. Like as Christians, a lot of times we'll avoid the Old Testament. Not just that, pastors will primarily only preach out of the New Testament. And it's like, okay, there's a God of the New Testament and a God of the Old Testament. And they're like completely different. But the problem with that, what ends up happening when we have that kind of mentality, is we reject a big part of God's story. Like the biggest part of the Bible, 2/3 of it is the Old Testament. And we end up rejecting that, and we miss out not on the most important part, which is the gospel, but on the biggest part of God's story. It's kind of like this, trying to think of an illustration that would help us understand this more clear. And I was thinking about this. So last week, Rantoul and Monticello played in a football game. And on Saturday and Sunday, numerous people walked up to me and were basically like, haha, you lost to Monticello. It happens every year. And they didn't really do that. Steve Royce, he does that. He'll be like, haha, you lost to Monticello. But in some way, that was communicated to me multiple times. And that's good. You should do that. That's part of playing sports. That's part of it. If you're not razzing each other, then sports loses a lot of its meaning. And so, like, I get that. And I was thinking about it. And I think that a lot of y'all, it's not your job to know this, but a lot of y'all don't understand, like, the whole story of the Rantoul football, which is okay. You're not supposed to. But if you understood the whole story, the score, you'd be able to look at that score and be like, oh, that makes sense. Like, for example, my first year coaching, our best player committed suicide, and we lost him, and our whole team was destroyed all that year. The year after that, our best player got in a car crash and was paralyzed from the waist down, and that destroyed our team. Last year, we came to play you guys. You guys had played 2 games and had a month straight of practice. We had played 0 games and had been out with COVID and had 1 practice before we played you guys. So we lost 40-something to nothing, but there was a reason. When you don't play any games or practice, you're going to be pretty bad. And then even this year, we were losing. Our best player was on quarantine with COVID. And even the other things that y'all don't see, such as our kids go home mostly to single-parent families where your guys' kids do not. And a lot of our kids live well underneath the income that kids in Monticello do, right? And you start to see, like, we're just even fighting to keep kids eligible, where in Monticello, that's not as huge of a problem. And you bring all this in, and the story starts to become a little bit clearer. You can see why it's 28-0. It's not necessarily that our players are less athletic than yours, or our coaches are not as good as your guys'. It's that there's a whole story behind it. When you start to see the whole story, everything else becomes clearer. And the same is true with the Bible. Like when you start to see the whole story that God has had from the very beginning in the Old Testament, it starts to become clearer. I think that may be one reason why we, as a church whole, like in our country, have not very mature disciples, because we don't kind of understand the whole story of God. We just kind of look at bits and pieces of it. So what Steve and I are planning on doing for the next 8 to 10 weeks leading up into Christmas are looking at Old Testament characters in the Bible, so we can kind of get a clearer picture. I have really 2 motives behind this, me personally. What I want to do is I want to show that God has had the same story from beginning to end. Like I said, we often think that there's a God of the Old Testament who is angry and a God of the New Testament who is loving. I want to show that God has had one plan throughout the whole Bible, throughout his whole history. And the other thing I want to do is show us that God is really teaching us the same things in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Well, it comes out a little bit differently. Like in the Old Testament, we're not supposed to eat pork, and you can only wear certain types of clothing together. Really deep down, the motive was so you would be a holy people. So they'd be a holy people and be distinct and stick out, be light to the world. And the New Testament's that same idea. God gives us commands so we'd be distinct and holy and be a light to the world. So I want to show that God is really teaching us the same thing in the Old Testament and the New. And so we're going to go through the Old Testament. And today we're going to start with the story of Abraham. So Mike's going to come up now, and he's going to read Genesis chapter 22. As he comes up, we're going to read the story of how Abraham was called to sacrifice Isaac. I'll also go back. We don't have the slide for that. Before he reads it, just want to say, God is not calling you to sacrifice your kid. God is not calling you to kill anyone. I just want to make that clear. That Abraham was a very specific character in the Old Testament and a very special character. So if you have any thoughts like that, I would just ask that you would reach out and get some help on that. I just wanted to clarify because I know some people can read the story and be pretty wigged out. And so Mike's going to read to us Genesis chapter 22.
Genesis 22. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham! And he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from the altar, from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. He said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of God, of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called to the name of that place, The Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven, and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. Now after these things, it was told to Abraham, Behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. Uz his firstborn, Buz his brother, Kemuel his father of Aram, Chesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel, as Bethuel fathered Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Moreover, his concubine, whose name was Ramah, bore Teba, Gaham, Tahash, and Makkah.
That was impressive, Mike. Got all those names right. I'm not going to be reading through the text a whole lot. I'm going to be pointing different pieces out, so I thought it'd be good if someone would read it, and Mike is the best candidate for that. So before we jump into this text, got to lay out one thing real quick so we understand, and then we'll kind of look at what we're going to look at today. God doesn't tempt us, he tests us, and I think a lot of us may know that. Temptation is something that someone does to set us up to fail, right? So Satan will tempt us, or someone who wants to hurt us will tempt us. Their goal is that we fail. However, God tests us, and the goal of testing is 1, that we would pass and grow in him, or 2, that we would actually fail and then still grow and learn from it. So it's this idea of we either win or we learn. And so God tests Abraham here. And we're going to see 3 things. We're going to see that faith creates. We're going to see that faith creates action, faith creates calmness, and faith creates a way. The first thing we're going to see is that what God was doing in here, he was trying to create faith in Abraham. And in doing so, we see that faith creates action. If you look here with me in verse 3, this will be on the slideshow also, so from here on out, everything will be on the slideshow. Verse 3 says this, So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and and took his son, the two of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place which God had told him. And so what we see is Abraham here wakes up early. Now, if God comes to me in a vision and says, hey, sacrifice your only son, one, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm probably not doing that. I do not think I would have the faith to do that. But number two, if that happens, I would do it kicking and screaming. Like, I wouldn't wake up the next morning early to go do this. I would drag it out as long as I could. But what we see with Abraham is he wakes up early in the morning. He wakes up before the sun comes up. He goes out and he cuts his trees and he gets his son and the servants together and he's ready to do this. And then you also see here in verse 9, we see the action that he takes. Verse 9 says, when they came to the place to which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Not just that, like Abraham follows through. He takes his son Isaac, lies him on an altar and straps him down. Isaac very well knows what is going on at this point. Like, he has seen his father offer sacrifices before. I just want you to process like what Abraham is going through right now and what Isaac is feeling right now. Like, he is screaming, he is yelling, he is frustrated, he is confused. His little son is just broken. Like, just imagine when you had kids or if you had kids. And just imagine having your kid go through that. It would be heartbreaking. This past Tuesday, Bronson was playing soccer, and he was lost and confused out there while they were scrimmaging. And my heart was breaking for him, just seeing him being sad in that moment. It was like, oh my gosh, my poor son. Now imagine what Abraham was feeling as he laid his son down, and his son is screaming and yelling and doesn't understand what is going on here. Like, that's a whole lot of faith that leads to action. The truth is that when we have faith, action comes out of us. The question that I have to start out today for you is this, is like, do you have action? Like, do you actually have action? I'm not saying here that action creates faith, that somehow we have to do something to earn God's love and do something to earn faith. But when we have true faith, action is birthed out of that. I think there are so many Christians in the world today who think that they're good with God because they simply have professed something with their mouth. And they have simply said something to God. But we're going to take a look here, and what Jesus is going to tell us in the New Testament is that, hey, it's not just a profession, but we have to have action that follows because action is birthed out of faith. I'm going to look at one of the hardest texts in the entire Bible. It's Matthew chapter 7. So if you got your Bible, you can flip over there with me. Matthew chapter 7. What Jesus is doing here is he's finishing up the Sermon on the Mount. And he laid out his case and was showing, hey, this is how we should live for the kingdom. And then he says this in verse 13. He says, enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. And those who enter it by many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who enter it are few. So he lays out two gates. He says there's one gate, it's big and wide, and most people are walking down it. And then there's another gate that's narrow and small, and very few are actually walking down it. And what he's saying is, hey, this narrow gate is the gate I just laid out to you. Like, hey, loving your neighbor as yourself. Do not commit adultery. All these things he's laid out in the Sermon on the Mount. And then he says this in verse 21, which should really shatter us, should be really shocking to us. He says this, not everyone who says unto me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name? And then will I declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. What he says is someone will come up to him and say, Lord, Lord. Now, when in Hebrew, when they put a word down twice, it's supposed to put special emphasis on it. It's like when we capitalize and bold something. So when someone says something twice, it's like, hey, really focus. So people will walk up to Jesus and not just call him God, but we'll call him Lord, Lord. Like emphatically, Lord, Lord, didn't I do something for you? Like didn't I do this for you? And what Jesus will say to them is, wrong side here. But the one who does the will of my Father is the one who gets into heaven. The one who actually does what God has commanded are the people who get to take part in the kingdom. Not the people who just say, Lord, Lord, but the people who actually follow the commands and the words of Jesus. Not because they're earning anything, but because there's faith inside of them, and that births action. What we see here is it's not people who are moral conservatives that are Christians. It's not people who simply attend church that are Christians. It's not people who just simply say something with their mouth. It's people who actually follow the words of Jesus.
Right.
What Jesus is saying here, just read that again. He's real clear in verse 21. Not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, not everyone who says, I am Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but actually those who are doing the commands that I have commanded them.
That's right.
Now, if that doesn't shake you a little bit, I don't really know what will. It's just tough here because I think we've built Christianity on this idea that, hey, if you just confess that God is God, then you're right with God. But the truth is that people do that and they don't have actual faith. They just have what is beliefism. This idea that, hey, I believe in God, so I'm good with God. What Jesus is saying here is this faith has to transform you. If you're not transformed by it at all, you don't have true faith. And so I guess the question is not do we have action, but do you have love for Jesus? If you looked at your life and you've seen your life, do you actually love him? Because if you love him, that leads to change and that leads to action. I've said this illustration before, but I think it is so important and it would be so good in understanding this. If I tell you I love my wife, and I come up here and I say I love her, which I really do, but then you guys put a camera up in my house and you watch me for a week and you see, well, first day of the week I come home from work and I bring McDonald's home and I bring the boys home 2 Happy Meals. I give myself a Big Mac and a large fry and a drink, and I start eating it. And Chassie's like, where's my food? I'm like, you go make yourself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And then the next day, I order this new couch. I say, hey, you take the old couch out. I want you to take it out piece by piece, and I want you to bring the new couch in by yourself. And so she does all that, sets the couch down. I go to sit on the couch. The boys go to sit on the couch. She goes to sit on the couch. I'm like, no, you sit on the ground. And then the next day, I decide we're going to go on vacation. So I'm like, hey, pack up the boys' bags, pack up my bags, and we're going to take off. So she does that, puts all the bags in the back of the car, gets the boys loaded up. She goes to get in the front seat. I'm like, no, you're staying home. She actually, now that I'm thinking about it, she might actually like that, to be home by herself or without the boys for a couple of weeks. So that might not be a bad thing. But if I do all that, and do I actually love her? Like if I treat her like that, even if I say with my mouth I love her, do I actually love her? Absolutely not, because our actions show what we love. Jesus is saying the same thing. What we're reading here in the life of Abraham is the same thing. Your actions show if you actually have faith. Not just your words, but your actions itself. Your actions itself. And so the question is, do you love him? I want to be honest. There are people, maybe even in this room, who think that are Christian. They think they're Christian and they're actually not, just because they grew up in church. And we can't just be a church that wants to play church and be okay with saying, I love Jesus, but then not following after the words of Jesus. This is what Abraham is trying to show us here. It's not people who just say, oh, I follow. It's people who actually follow. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be a perfect following. I'm not saying you're going to do everything right and every step is going to be good. We see in the life of Abraham, we see the brokenness that he has. Like, we see that at one point, we see he has faith here, but then a couple of chapters later, he's like hiding his wife because saying it's his sister, even though God says, go in, do this, and trust me, and he doesn't. So it's not a perfect faith, but it's a faith. It starts with a little bud popping out, and it's more and more and more, and we continually grow and follow in him. And so the question is, do you love him, and are you growing in love for him? What we see first is that faith creates action. The second thing we see is that faith actually creates calmness. Well, look again here in verse 9. It'll be the next slide, Austin. Verse 9 of Genesis. It says, when they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there, laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. When this idea of that he laid the wood in order in Hebrew, it's this idea that he nice and neatly stacked up the wood. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm in this position, I'm doing this kicking and screaming, right? Like I'm throwing the wood down, I'm murmuring under my breath, I'm probably cursing, I'm frustrated, I'm angry. What does Abraham do here? He nice and neatly stacks the wood up. It's because his faith has created a calmness in him. Why is he so calm? I think Hebrews chapter 11 helps us understand why he's so calm. We can look at that real quick. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 through 19. It says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promise was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it is said, through Isaac your offspring shall be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. what Hebrews lets us in on is this idea that that Abraham knew, even if he sacrificed Isaac, that God was going to bring him back to life. He was so calm because he trusted the promises of God. And so we as followers of Jesus can trust the promises of God. When the world says, hey, you should live like this and this will lead to true life, we can trust God's promises and say, no, God says that, hey, we should live this way and that'll lead to true life. Or when people condemn us and Satan condemns us and says you're nothing and you're worthless and you don't have no value, we can trust God's promise that we actually do have value because we are created in his image. And that he loves us unconditionally when we're in Christ because Jesus took our sin and we get the righteousness of Jesus. We can trust the promises of God, and that brings us calmness. It brings us a supernatural calmlessness. You guys are probably tired of hearing football stories, but it's football season for me, so y'all have to deal with it. That's how God's working through me right now. So this past week, we played Unity, and we got smacked. Like, it was horrible. We actually played well in the first quarter. We were in the red zone twice in the first quarter, and that seems to be a common theme for us. We just can't score in the red zone. But we get towards the end of the second quarter, we're down 21-0. And this play right here kind of just shows what our season has been like. Our quarterback gets the ball. We run a counter play, which you probably don't understand. We fake a run one way and run back the other way. And it's wide open. We have a blocker in front of our quarterback and nothing but green grass in front of him. So our lineman is in front of our quarterback, and he's running like this. Really just extending these hands back. I don't know, I've never taught him to do that, but he was like full sprinter mode, like getting like this. Quarterback is right behind him. All of a sudden, wide open touchdown, nothing but green grass and a lineman in front of him. Our lineman is running, kicks his hand back, punches the ball right out of our quarterback's hands, fumbles it on the ground, and then the Unity players who are trailing behind pick it up. It was like, oh my gosh, if that doesn't like show what Rancho football is, I don't know what is. It was frustrating and it was aggravating, and we had players yelling on the sidelines, and coach is angry, and everyone is frustrated, and I'm up there just calm as a cucumber. And someone radioed up. I sit up top and I watch and I see what's going on. I tell everyone on the field what's going on. I'm in the booth, and one of the coaches is like, "Hey, well, why are you so calm?" And I was thinking about it and processing. I didn't really give a good answer at the time, but the truth is that I'm calm because I know why I coach. Like, I want to win games so bad. And don't get me wrong, I would love to do that. But like I said, our situation is so much different than any other football teams in our conference. Like, kids are coming home to single-parent families, almost every kid. Most kids are living well below the poverty line. Like, I understand my purpose there is more than just to win football games. It's because I want to love them, care for them, and I want to talk to them about Jesus, which I get opportunities to every week, and I love it. That's why I was calm, because I knew why I was there. I knew the purpose that God has given me. When we understand his purpose and we understand his promises, it gives us a supernatural calmness to get through any situation. Abraham here, he understands the promises of God. He knows that his purpose is that God's going to give him a son, that's going to give him another son, that's going to give him another son, which is going to bring the Messiah. He trusts in that. The same is true for us today. We can trust God's promises. I think one area, and it's something that I'm just processing right now, that I think a lot of people struggle with is like identity and anxiety and worth. And some people, especially younger people, feel like I don't have worth. I'm nothing but a pile of crud. And they feel like just a lack of meaning. But God would tell you that I love you and I care about you and I give you purpose when you come to me. I love you not because of what you've done, but because of what Jesus has done for you. And so faith gives us a supernatural calmness. So we see that faith creates action, that faith creates calmness, but the third thing we're going to see to kind of sum up here is that faith creates a way. Instead of me going into a long spiel about this, I got a short 5-minute video for us to watch, and then I'll come back and recap it. So we're going to see how faith creates a way also. If you could go to that video for me, please. Hold on. Thought it was all muted. It was definitely.
Fine. Right. It seems pretty simple. There's this crazy story at the beginning of the Bible. We have Adam and Eve, and they're in the Garden of Eden.
And everything in this garden is great. It's exactly as it should be. Except there's this one tree that they're told by God not to eat from because it's dangerous and it will kill them.
So that's it. Avoid this fruit tree and we're fine.
Right. It seems pretty simple. But in this garden, there's a snake. And it starts telling a different story. It says that if you eat of this tree, it's not going to kill you. In fact, it's going to make you become like God.
And Adam and Eve, they believe the snake, and they eat the fruits.
And because of this, the goodness of the garden is tragically lost, and evil and death enters into God's good world.
Now, why is there a talking snake in the garden? I mean, this thing is a problem.
Yeah, it's very strange. And even more strange is the fact that the Bible doesn't say why or how this thing even got there. It just presents the snake as this creature who's in rebellion against God and that wants to get other people to doubt God's goodness and lead them on a path towards death. And so whatever this snake is, it's the source of evil that pervades our world and our lives, even still today.
But there is some hope, because right here in the story, God makes this really interesting promise to Adam and Eve.
That someone is going to come in the future, a son of Eve. And this guy's going to come and he's going to crush the serpent's head and destroy evil at its source. However, during this battle, the serpent is going to bite this guy's heel.
So it's like a mutual destruction.
Yeah, it's this very strange but beautiful promise. And it's just left hanging there until the next key moment in the story, when God singles out this guy named Abraham and says that through his family, goodness and blessing is going to be restored back to all of the nations of the world. And as we follow this family, we get to one of Abraham's great-grandsons, this guy named Judah. And he receives this promise that a king is going to come from his line, and that the whole world's going to follow this king, and he's going to bring peace and harmony, and there'll be lots of food and wine and milk and vineyards, and it's going to be awesome.
The first king that we meet from the line of Judah is a guy named King David. And he's a hero. Maybe he is the snake crusher.
But it turns out that David is infected with the same evil as the rest of humanity. He never crushes the snake, just the opposite. However, God makes a promise to David that this king is going to eventually come from his line. But as you go on in the story, one by one, each generation of his sons, they're just total chumps. They give into the snake, they choose evil, they go after money and sex and power and following other gods.
Things get so bad that they run the nation of Israel right into the ground, and the big bad empire of Babylon just takes them out.
And so now there are no more kings to even fulfill this promise.
So it seems like the whole plan is lost.
But during these dark days, there's this crazy group of guys called prophets. And they just kept talking about this coming king and reminding us of the promise that he'll come, he'll defeat evil, he'll restore the garden. Now, one specific prophet, Isaiah, he tells us more about why this king is bitten. Isaiah says that the promised king receives this wound because of humanity's evil, and that it kills him. But then all of a sudden he comes back. And Isaiah says it's because he suffered this wound that he can now become a source of healing to other people.
But the Old Testament ends, and the snake-crushing king that everyone's been talking about never shows up.
And this is why, when the New Testament begins, it introduces us to Jesus of Nazareth, not as some random guy, but as someone who comes to fulfill these specific ancient promises.
Yeah, we learn that he's from the line of David, Judah, and Abraham.
And he goes around Israel announcing that the goodness of God's kingdom is here, now. And he begins confronting the effects of evil on people by healing them, by forgiving them of their sins and evil.
Many people are now believing that this is, in fact, the promised king.
But Jesus began telling his closest followers that he was going to become king and bring peace by taking the full effect of humanity's evil into himself.
The fatal snakebite wound.
Exactly. And so it seems like the serpent wins. And this story actually would be a tragedy except for what happens next. Jesus rises from the dead.
And now Jesus has the power over evil and death for himself.
And so the rest of the New Testament is then making this claim that Jesus' power over evil and death has now become available to us to begin confronting the effects of evil in our lives.
But even still, death and evil are a real problem in our world all around us.
And so the story of the Bible ends by describing this future day when Jesus comes back and he finishes the job. He destroys the snake once and for all, and he restores the goodness of the garden here on earth. Hey, this is Tim.
And this is John.
We think one of the best ways to understand the Bible is to trace the key themes from its beginning all the way through to the end.
We also make videos that walk through the literary structure of every book of the Bible and how it relates to the whole.
Here's something you didn't know. John and I were roommates in college, and we lived in the basement of a dirty old house.
We're a nonprofit, and we'd love to keep these videos free for everyone, but we need your help.
You can go to jointhebibleproject.com, and you can get full-res versions of these videos. You can download the study guide. It's all for free. Jointhebibleproject.com.
I love those guys. Make everything so clear. So, what I said at the beginning was that there's one story running throughout the whole Bible. When a first century Jew and Jesus would read the story of Abraham, they would read things like, yes, we need to have faith. But what they would actually see is the one story that's running through that God promised Abraham an offspring. That's what they would see in this story. And they'd see God's faithfulness in keeping that offspring alive. And then we'd see that Isaac would have Jacob, and Jacob would have multiple sons, and then those sons eventually, Moses would come through, and person after person, judges and kings and prophets. And eventually that Jesus would come and would destroy sin and death. And so we see not only that faith creates change and that faith creates calmness, but faith creates a way for us to have a relationship with God. And it's through the story of Abraham that we see this so clearly, that God is trying to make a way. He's sending forth the Messiah to save us from our sins. And so now, as we come to an end of the sermon, we're going to move into communion. And I thought this was the perfect time to have communion at the end instead of at the beginning, because we got to just watch the whole story of God making a way. But the truth is, the story doesn't stop there, right? It continues inside of us. God is redeeming and working in us, and that's why we take communion, is to show, hey, I align with Jesus. So real quick, just 2 minutes, just want you to reflect about your sin, reflect about the grace in God's life. We'll have a little music playing for us. Then I'll come forward, read some scripture, and then we'll take communion together. So go ahead and reflect. God, we love you. Thank you for your grace. Thank you for your spirit. Thank you that you work through the whole story of the Bible, that there's not two separate gods, one who is angry and one who is loving, but you're one God who hates sin but loves people and is working to redeem that brokenness and sin inside of people. Pray that as we go through the Old Testament, that we'll see that story, that we'll see how we should live and see, hey, things like that, but we'll also see that you're working through the Old Testament to bring us the Messiah, Jesus, and that there's one big story working through it. And we pray this week that the faith that we have will bring us change, that it will bring us calmness, and that we'll see that it makes a way for us. I don't know what particular situations that we're all going through this week, but I pray that you work in it, Lord, that you change us and shape us and make us more like you. And so next week when we come back here, we can come back changed and renewed and more like the image of Jesus. We thank you for his life, death, and resurrection. We thank you that you chose us and love us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, free to go.